We live in a world obsessed with quick fixes. New books, new routines, new mindsets. But what if I told you most of the answers you're looking for about confidence, purpose, and becoming a strong man were already figured out 100 years ago? This video is not just another self-help summary. It's a journey through how men have tried to improve themselves for over a century. Through war, depression, rebellion, and reinvention, each decade tells us something about who we are and who we could be. Let's go back to the start. 1900s, the moral builder. This was the age of steam, suits, and the first plane. Self-help meant character. It was about becoming a good man, honest, disciplined, and reliable. You weren't chasing followers. That stuff would be weird. You were trying to become someone others could respect in silence. You, as a man, would wake up early, do his job, help his neighbor, not for likes, just because it was right. So, masculinity meant being useful. Why? Because the Industrial Revolution didn't reward loudness. It rewarded collective reliability. Role models in those times were Andrew Carnegie, Theodore Roosevelt, Booker T. Washington, and also the Wright brothers that invented the airplane in 1903. 1910, the Great Soldier. Then World War I started, between the Austria-Hungary and Serbia conflict. This was also the time of the sinking of the Titanic, the use of the first military tanks, and the invention of telegrams. In those times, self-help wasn't a book, it was primal survival, because you didn't journal about your goals. You carried your brother through the trenches and mud. This meant staying strong and silent even when life was painful. Masculinity meant sacrifice and unbreakable will. Why? Because the world was on fire, and men were told to hold the line. Role models in those times were Ernest Shackleton, Winston Churchill, and the unnamed soldier. 1920s, the self-made man. Then the war ends, the economy explodes. Jazz, cigars, fast cars. Men flipped the script. Now it was about charm, success, and ambition. Self-help became sexy. It was about looking sharp, making money, and building your name. An example of this was that you started a business, wore a nice suit, and proved you came from nothing. Why? Because after years of chaos, men wanted to feel powerful again. Role models in those times were Henry Ford, Babe Ruth, Al Capone, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. 1930s, the Stoic survival. The party ended. The Great Depression crossed the dream. The stock market crash of 1929 led to global financial collapse, testing men's ability to lead and endure. Now it wasn't about men's ambition, it was about feeding your family. Self-help became about doing whatever it takes to survive. Sure, there were people who went extremely rich this decade, but for most it wasn't the case. Masculinity meant keep going. No excuses, just find a way. Why? Because quitting wasn't the option and no one was coming to save you. So you had to be a tough motherfucker. Role models in those times were Franklin Roosevelt, Joe Louis, and Charles Lindbergh. 1940s, the heroic provider. Another war, World War II. Big events in those times were the Holocaust genocide, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombing, and D-Day. Men gave everything, their lives, their mental health, their silence. Masculinity was tied to bravery, honor, and service. Self-help became duty of your country. And when the war ended, it wasn't over. Men came home to rebuild the world and themselves. Why? Because the world needed fixing, and men were expected to be the foundation. Role models in those times were soldiers such as Pavlichenko, Simo Aya, and Audie Murphy, Anne Frank, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and others that influenced the war. 1950s, the stable man. The 50s recognized itself with the inventions of the color television, first universal credit card, and the microchip. Big events happened. Here were rock and roll explosion, discovery of DNA, and the successes of Sputnik 1 and 2. Self-help was about conformity, doing your part, keeping things in line. Masculinity was measured by how stable you were, not how deep you were with the focus on having steady jobs. Because after 2 wars, men didn't want to have freedom. They wanted to have peace inside. Because where World War I, men came home to survive, wounded, confused, and left to carry the pain alone. World War II, men came home to rebuild, expected to be strong providers, with no space to process what they've been through. Role models in those times were Walt Disney, Martin Luther King Jr., Elvis Presley, and Albert Einstein. 1960s, the conscious seeker. This was the age of the first moon landing, assassinations of JFK and MLK, and the birth of hippies. In the 60s, men started to question everything. You know, society, war, themselves, and self-help became about thinking deeper, asking questions, and standing for truth. Books like Psycho-Cybernetics gave men permission to explore their inner world, often for the first time. Why? Because men realized being strong isn't enough if you don't know why you're doing it. Before the 60s, self-help was mostly about character, control, and success. So that was a big shift. Role models in those times were JFK, MLK Jr., Bob Dylan, Muhammad Ali, and Neil Armstrong. 1970s, the inner explorer. This was the decade where the email MRI machine, video cassette recorders were the inventions that time. Besides that, it was the end of the Vietnam War, fall of dictatorships in Spain, Portugal, and Greece, and the establishment of Microsoft. Where the 60s were about awareness, the 70s was about application. Men went inward. They explored therapy, emotions, meditation, and Eastern wisdom. In this period, self-help was about facing your wounds instead of running from them. For the first time, vulnerability was seen as strength. Why? Because the system failed too many, and men had to rebuild from the inside. Role models were Carl Jung, Nelson Mandela, Bruce Lee, and David Bowie. 1980s, the peak performer. We recognize the 80s for the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Chernobyl disaster, the Challenger space shuttle explosion, and game-changing inventions such as the PC and the mobile phone. The 80s were about action, power, and results. And self-help became a system, like a checklist, a formula to follow, such as wake up at 5, train hard, set goals, and dominate your day. Why? Because the world felt chaotic, and control became the new safety net. Men didn't want to feel, they wanted to perform. Emotions were distractions, and self-help told you if you weren't succeeding, it's because you weren't working hard enough. This was the area of be more, do more, and show more. Well, role models in those times were Schwarzenegger, Tony Robbins, Sylvester Stallone, Michael Jordan, big muscles, bigger goals, total focus. And even icons like Steve Jobs and Ronald Reagan became symbols of clarity, confidence, and domination. The 1990s, the balanced achiever. The 90s were a time of big change. The fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of the internet, and the heartbreak of tragedies like Rwanda genocide and the death of Princess Diana. Technologies move fast. SMS, PlayStation, Google, DVDs, and Bluetooth all enters our lives. The world got louder, faster, and more connected than ever. Men still wanted success, but now they also crave peace inside. They were done chasing just money or status. They wanted to feel whole. Self-help evolved. It wasn't just about waking up early and dominating anymore. It was about understanding yourself. Because achievement without connection started to feel hollow, you know? Men began to realize being strong isn't enough. If you don't know how to feel, how to love, or how to listen, you lose something deeper. And this was the start of a new kind of masculinity. One where calm became powerful. Role models like Will Smith, Keanu Reeves, Michael Jordan, and Bill Gates showed a different kind of strength. 2000, the authentic man. The 2000s shook the world awake. 9/11, the Iraq War, the Indian Ocean tsunami. Suddenly life felt fragile, and men started asking deeper questions such as, why am I here and what actually matters? Self-help began shifting from performance to purpose. It wasn't just about goals anymore. It was about meaning. Men were no longer chasing success for others. They wanted to feel real, honest, and grounded in their own values. Why? Because the old way, hustle without heart, started to feel fake. They wanted to live with intentions. Role models in those times were Jay-Z, Brad Pitt, and Obama because they showed a new version of masculinity. Meanwhile, the rise of internet, Google Maps, social media, the iPhone connected us more than ever, yet left many feeling more lost than ever. 2010, the mindful warrior. The 2010s were fast, noisy and overwhelming. The rise of smartphones and social media turned attention into a new currency. And most men didn't even realize how expensive that trade-off was. So self-help took a turn. It became less about pushing and more about pausing. Men started to value stillness, and being present became a new form of strength. Why? Because focus was under attack and distraction was everywhere. Masculinity in this area became more internal. Strong wasn't loud, it was grounded. Men worked on discipline, breathing and staying centered, no matter what life threw at them. Role models like Dave Goggins, Rogan, Gary Vee showed that you could be tough and thoughtful at the same time. 2020s, the integrated or lost man. Now we're here, man, in the middle of a contradiction. The time of the COVID pandemic, wars in Ukraine and Israel, AI platforms taking over. Men today are expected to be everything. Strong but soft, ambitious but chill, disciplined but emotionally available. And no one ever showed us how to carry all that at once. Self-help in the 2020s isn't polished, it's raw. It's no longer about having all the answers. It's about being honest enough to ask the right questions. Why? Because the world was on fire again. COVID-19 forced everyone to sit still and face themselves. Now self-help isn't a path, it's a balancing act between building your future and healing from your past. Between showing up in the world and not losing yourself in the process. Role models in those times: Andrew Huberman, Peterson, Jocko, Mr. Beast. Well, they're not perfect, they're not pretending, just men try to figure it out in public. So what does this all tell us? Every decade swung between extremes, like silence and expression, toughness and depth, order and rebellion. But now, the future of masculinity isn't about choosing sides. It's about holding both.